Welcome to the deep dive. We love to really get into the weeds on this show, and today we're diving deep into the world of cannabis and brain plasticity. Specifically, how cannabis interacts with our brains while they're still developing.
Yeah, and we're going to zero in on this system called the endocannabinoid system.
Ooh, the ECS.
The ECS, exactly. It plays a huge role in how our brains adapt and change over time.
Now, I know a lot of our listeners are pretty new to cannabis, so I want to make sure we're explaining this stuff in a way that makes sense. No super complicated medical jargon, so you don't have to have a PhD to follow along.
Totally. Think of it like this. The ECS is this massive communication network in your body, and it reaches like every corner of your brain and even all your organs.
It's like a control panel for your whole body.
Right. It controls how we learn things, form memories, deal with emotions, sleep, even how we handle pain and what we want to eat.
Wow. It's pretty wild to think there's this whole system working behind the scenes that we don't even realize is there.
Absolutely. And get this, cannabis, or specifically the THC in it, can really mess with this system, like throwing a wrench in the gears.
Okay, so THC, that's what gets people high, right?
Exactly.
So how's it doing all that? Like, how's it messing with the ECS?
So THC basically latches onto these special receptors on the surface of cells, these things called CB1 receptors.
What are those?
Well, you can kind of think of them like doorways. And when THC unlocks these doorways, it sets off a whole chain reaction inside the brain.
Oh, so our bodies already have something that unlocks those doorways.
You got it. Our body naturally makes these compounds called endocannabinoids.
Endo what?
Endocannabinoids.
Okay.
And one of them is called anandamide, and some people call it the bliss molecule.
The bliss molecule. What makes it so blissful?
Well, it's involved in all those good feelings, happiness and well-being, and THC kind of mimics it and fits into those same doorways, but it's way more intense and sticks around for longer. So that's where those happy vibes come from. But it sounds like there's more to the story than just good vibes. We were talking about brain plasticity before. How does cannabis fit into all that?
Right, so brain plasticity, remember, is the brain's ability to change and adapt over time.
Yeah.
And there's some interesting new research out of the Netherlands Institute for Neuroscience that's shaking things up a bit. Turns out THC doesn't just target the main brain cells, we think, with, those neurons.
Right.
It also affects these other cells called astrocytes.
Astrocytes. I thought those were just like helper cells, like the support staff for the neurons, not the main players in the brain.
Yeah, that's what scientists thought for a long time. But this new research is showing that astrocytes are way more important for brain development than we ever thought. And guess what? They have those CB1 receptors too, those doorways that THC can unlock. So that means cannabis is directly messing with them. Okay, hold on. I'm trying to wrap my head around all this. So before we go any further, can we just back up for a second and explain what brain plasticity is? Like in simple terms, for those of us who don't have a neuroscience degree.
Okay, so picture your brain as a city. Right. A big bustling city. It's got these intricate networks of roads that connect all the different areas. Brain plasticity is basically the brain's ability to remodel those roads, constantly building new pathways and making the existing ones stronger.
So it's like construction work in the brain.
Exactly. And this construction is based on all our experiences and what we learn. It's what helps us adapt to new things, pick up new skills, and form memories.
So is this rewiring happening all the time? Like 247?
Pretty much. But there are these specific times, these critical periods where the brain is extra flexible and open to change. Think of it like those city roads are under major construction during rush hour. And one of those prime times is childhood and adolescence.
Oh, so like teenage years.
Exactly.
That's when the brain's plasticity is really at its peak. So I'm guessing that's where the cannabis comes in.
You got it.
Like using cannabis during those teenage years, could that actually affect how our brains develop?
That's the big question, right? And that's what we're going to get into next.
Okay, this is getting good. So stay tuned, folks. We'll be right back after a quick break.
And this is where things get interesting when we're talking about cannabis and young brains. Remember those CB1 receptors on the astrocytes?
Yeah, the doorways.
Right. So the research suggests that when THC binds to those receptors during these critical periods, it can actually mess with the whole plasticity process.
So it's like throwing a wrench into the brain's construction crew right when they're in the middle of building those important neural pathways.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it. To really see what was going on, the researchers in the Netherlands looked at the visual cortex in mice. That's the part of the brain that processes what they see. And they found that when they removed those CB1 receptors specifically from the astrocytes, the mice had a hard time adapting to changes in visual input. Their brains just couldn't adjust and rewire as well.
So were they like visually impaired, like they couldn't see properly?
No, not quite. Their vision was fine. It was more that their brains weren't as plastic, as adaptable, and that adaptability is super important for learning and memory.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Think about it. Every time you learn something new, your brain has to make new connections. It has to rewire itself.
That's pretty amazing. So even though this research was done on mice, it makes you wonder, could using cannabis regularly
hmm
during those teenage years, when the brain is still under construction, could that really have a lasting impact on how our brains develop?
That's the million-dollar question, and researchers are trying to figure that out. We definitely need more research, especially on humans, but this study definitely raises some serious concerns about the potential long-term consequences of starting cannabis use early and frequently.
So we're talking about potential issues with learning and memory, right?
Yeah, and maybe even more than that. It could affect other things like attention, decision-making, even the ability to plan and control impulses.
Wow, this is making me think back to high school. A lot of kids thought cannabis was totally harmless. Some even thought it was good for creativity.
Well, it's important to remember that everyone's brain is different. How cannabis affects you depends on things like your genes, how often you use it, how old you were when you started, even the specific strain of cannabis.
Okay, so there's a lot of nuances. It's not just as simple as saying cannabis is good or bad for your brain.
Exactly. And we really have to emphasize that this research is specifically about the risks of THC, especially during adolescence. But THC is just one part of the cannabis story. There are all these other compounds in cannabis, like cannabidiol or CBD, that don't bind to those CB1 receptors the same way THC does.
Oh, right, CBD. I feel like I'm hearing about that everywhere these days. They put it in everything from face cream to coffee.
It's definitely having a moment. And unlike THC, CBD doesn't get you high. It's not psychoactive. And some studies suggest that CBD might even protect against some of the harmful effects of THC. It's a complicated relationship, and researchers are still trying to unravel how all these different compounds interact with the ECS.
So even though we're focusing on the brain, it sounds like the ECS does a lot more than just control our thoughts and
Oh,
memories.
absolutely. It's a whole body system. It's in our digestive system, our immune system, even our skin.
Wait, so cannabis could potentially affect all those things too?
Yes. And this is where it gets really interesting. For example, the ECS helps regulate how your gut moves, your appetite, even nausea and vomiting. That's why some people get the munchies after using cannabis.
Ah, that makes sense. And I've also heard that cannabis can help people who are experiencing nausea from chemotherapy.
Exactly. But we have to remember that messing with the ECS, especially through heavy or frequent cannabis use, can also have some downsides, like digestive issues, for instance.
So it's kind of a double-edged sword. Cannabis might have benefits for certain things, but it also comes with potential risks, especially when it disrupts the ECS.
Exactly. It's all about understanding those nuances, weighing the potential benefits against the risks, and making informed decisions about how, when, and even if to use cannabis.
I'm really glad we're talking about this because it's helping me connect all the dots between what I've heard about cannabis and how it actually works in the body. Before we move on, is there anything else about the ECS and its impact on our health that we should talk about?
Yeah, there's this one key concept that I think is really important: homeostasis.
Homeo what?
Homeostasis. It's basically the body's way of maintaining balance, keeping everything running smoothly, and the ECS is a big part of that.
So it's like an internal regulator.
Exactly. It's constantly fine-tuning our biological processes to keep everything in equilibrium.
So when we use cannabis, are we messing with that balance?
Well, it depends, but especially with THC, yeah, it can disrupt the ECS's natural rhythm, particularly during those critical periods of development.
This has been a real eye-opener. I feel like I've learned so much about the ECS and how cannabis interacts with our brains and bodies.
Me too. And it's important to remember that research on cannabis is still in its early stages. We're still learning about the complexities of the ECS and how cannabis fits into the picture.
So there's still a lot more to discover. Before we wrap up, do you have any final thoughts for our listeners?
I think the biggest takeaway is that cannabis isn't inherently good or bad. It's a complex plant with a wide range of effects, some that might be beneficial and some that might be harmful. The key is to approach it with curiosity and awareness, to understand the science behind it, and to make informed choices that align with your own needs and goals.
I love that. Knowledge is power. Well, listeners, that's it for our deep dive on cannabis and brain plasticity. We hope you found this exploration as insightful as we have. Remember, understanding the science behind cannabis helps us make informed decisions about our health and well-being. If you're thinking about using cannabis, Do your research, talk to your doctor, and make choices that feel right for you.
Stay curious and keep exploring.
Yeah, it really seems like the more we learn about this endocannabinoid system, the more we realize we don't know.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole area of research so exciting. There's still so much to learn, so many questions to answer. Like right now, scientists are trying to figure out exactly how THC messes with brain plasticity. And they want to know if those effects can be reversed or if they have long-term consequences.
Yeah, about a lot of parents are wondering about that, especially those with kids who, might be experimenting with cannabis.
Right. And we can't forget that every brain is different. Genetics, environment, personal experiences all play a role in how our brains develop and how we react to things like cannabis.
So there's no easy answer when it comes to how cannabis affects the brain.
Nope. What might be fine for one person could have totally different effects on someone else. That's why it's so important to be careful with cannabis, especially during those teenage years when the brain is still so vulnerable.
This has been a really eye-opening deep dive. I had so many questions coming into this, and now I feel like I have a much better grasp on how cannabis interacts with our brains and bodies.
Me too. And I think it's important to remember that while we've been focusing on the risks of cannabis, especially THC, there's a whole other side to this research that's exploring the potential benefits of targeting the ECS.
Oh, right. We talked about that a bit with CBD.
hmm
But what other therapeutic applications are scientists looking into?
Oh, they're investigating the use of cannabinoids for a whole bunch of things, both the ones found in cannabis and the ones our bodies make naturally. We're talking about chronic pain, epilepsy, multiple sclerosis, even mental health conditions like anxiety and depression.
Wow, that's a lot of possibilities.
It is, and it really shows you the potential of the ECS. There's a
Right.
lot of buzz in the scientific community about all the possibilities.
It sounds like we're just scratching the surface of what we know about the ECS.
I think so. And remember, even though cannabis might be helpful for some medical conditions, it's always important to talk to a doctor before using it for any health concerns. Self-treating with cannabis can be risky, so it's best to have guidance from a professional.
That's a great point. Well, we've covered a lot in this deep dive into cannabis and brain plasticity. We explored the endocannabinoid system, learned how THC can mess with it, especially during those crucial years when our brains are developing. And we even touched on some of the potential benefits of targeting the ECS.
What stands out to you the most?
For me, it's definitely the sheer complexity of this whole ECS thing
Hmm.
and how much we still don't know about it. It's mind-blowing that this system is working inside all of us all the time, affecting so many things about our health and well-being. And the fact that cannabis can have such a big impact on it, well, it's a little daunting, honestly.
Yeah, I agree. It really highlights how important knowledge is. The more we understand about cannabis and how it works in our bodies, the better decisions we can make about using it.
Absolutely. Well, listeners, that brings us to the end of our deep dive. We hope you enjoyed this exploration as much as we did. And remember, knowledge is power. Understanding the science behind cannabis gives us the power to make informed choices about our health and well-being. If you're considering using cannabis, do your research, talk to your doctor, and make the choice that feels right for you.
Until next time, keep exploring.